Welcome to COS Ohio Live podcast. The goal of this podcast is to address things that are happening in our country and in our government, and to tie in how Article 5 and Article 5 amending convention can address these problems. I'm Diana Tellis, Convention of States, Ohio. I am the state communications coordinator, and with me is my cohort and partner in crime, Jeremiah Campana, who joins me for these podcasts once a month. Jeremiah is basically a comms team member in Ohio. And behind the scenes, we'll get to see him later. We've got producer Matt, who is my son. He's a high school / college student. And we'll introduce him later, but he's helping us out. And we thank him for being here, as well as thank you to Jeremiah for taking time out of his day to be here.
I love being here. No sweat off my back.
Yep. Good. Thank you, Jeremiah. Appreciate it. Jeremiah has a lot more experience than I do at podcasting, and I appreciate having him on board. He's been awesome to have. So we are also very lucky tonight to have a leader in Convention of States. He was a tech attorney for many years before leading the Tea Party movement. I think that started around 2009. He is a warrior for liberty and for our fight to lobby our state legislators for a state amending convention under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. His efforts, along with our co-founder and constitutional attorney, Michael Ferris, laid the groundwork and the ground game for the Convention of States effort. And for 10 years, he has delivered unwavering loyalty and energy to our grassroots. As a communicator myself, quite honestly, I find his speaking ability just superior to just about anyone. And more importantly, he believes in America and he believes in God-given freedom. I welcome tonight President and co-founder of Convention of States, Mr. Mark Meckler.
Hey, great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate having you. So I'll just tell you now that this is actually mine and Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a veteran of podcasting. This is my third podcast. And Jeremiah has been generous enough to share that with me, and I appreciate having him. And it's funny that this is just our third podcast, because in retrospect, before you invite the president and co-founder of the organization that you work for, you'd think I'd get another maybe 10 or so, podcasts under my belt, but here we are. So good to have you. Good to be here. And I'm having fun so far. So Mark, I want you to know that for this podcast, I was asked to do it for Ohio. A lot of the flyover states are doing podcasts. And if I was going to spend the time doing it, I wanted it to be educational always, and that we would always talk about Article 5, that second clause of Article 5, and what we're doing here and what Convention of States is. There's nothing worse than stepping into a podcast and not really knowing what the heck people are talking about, or a radio show or something where they're chattering about how you can solve something or what this is about, and we've not reviewed it. So we want to review that. We do it every time we do a podcast so far and forevermore. And since there's really no better person for that job, would you mind giving us an overview of the second clause of Article 5, the state amending convention, and what Convention of States is doing?
Sure. So I'm going to set the stage here in the modern era, which is all of us that are on this podcast. And I guarantee everybody who's listening, we all believe that the federal government's out of control. It's overstepped its bounds. It does way too much. It does things that a lot of us consider fundamentally unconstitutional. Unfortunately, they fit within a framework created by the Supreme Court over the last 115 years. And so we're frustrated by that. And then we elect people and we expect them to fix everything. And they don't fix everything because they really can't fix everything, or sometimes the incentives are wrong. So for me, the question becomes, well, what do you do? And the framers of the United States Constitution gave us the answer to that question very specifically on September 15, 1787. Colonel George Mason stands up, he addresses the men in convention, and he says, we have a terrible problem with the Constitution we've drafted. This is 2 days before the end of convention, 2 days before they sign it. They're done, basically. And he says, we've made a mistake, which is we gave the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we didn't give the same power to the people acting through the states. And he asks, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will ever propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? It's almost a rhetorical question. It's so ridiculous. I believe if we had video, probably there was some laughter among the men there, probably some forehead slaps, like, how did we not deal with this? We kind of know that, actually, because Madison's notes are clear. In that moment, they say two Latin abbreviations, nin com, which stands for no comment or no debate. In other words, not one person said, Colonel Mason, you're out of line here. We don't want this. That doesn't make any sense. fact, we also know it's backed up because there was a draft proposed for the second clause of Article 5, giving the states the power to call a convention to propose amendments. And that draft was adopted unanimously. This is the only thing I'm aware of in the Constitution. No debate, unanimous adoption. So what they were telling us here 250 years hence, 247 years, is that the federal government's going to get out of control. It's going to become unresponsive to the people, and we're going to give you, the people acting through your states, the power to restrain it. That's what an Article 5 convention is all about. And the reason we're working to call an Article 5 convention is we believe it's out of control. We believe in the American people. We believe we have to get into convention, debate amendments, propose some amendments, and put the federal government back in the constitutional box. That's what the second clause of Article 5 gives us the power to do.
So then what that looks like on the ground then for the grassroots is we need 38 states to pass a resolution that says, yeah, we want in. All 50 can then join in and be in a convention and convene to write amendments to the Constitution.
I want to correct one number there. 34 states to call.
34 states.
And then 38 states to ratify once they propose amendments.
You know, the funny part of me in podcasting is I get my numbers wrong in podcast. I don't know why.
I knew you knew. We got to make sure people
34 states,
right.
States to pass, and 38 states would then ratify once each individual amendment that is written in convention is sent out to the states. So right. Yes.
Well, now here's the question for you: if these 34 states, they call it, what if all 50 of them don't want to show up? Just the ones that passed it show up. Is that a possibility that only the ones that ratified it and can go, and the rest to be like, I'm not being part of this?
Yeah, technically that's a possibility. This is what's called a general convention. It doesn't mean anything can be discussed. It means all states are invited no matter what. And so you're right. Once 34 states ask for it, the convention is convened. The other 16 states don't have to show up if they don't want to. I think they're all going to come. I'm going to give one caveat, which is Rhode Island didn't show up at the original Constitutional Convention. Last year, we held a simulated convention in Williamsburg. Unbelievably, we didn't plan this. The only state not to show up was Rhode Island. So all bets are off on Rhode Island.
Something about those Rhode Islanders.
Yep.
Well, we would hope they would find a way to get to this one, but we'll see. We'll see about that. So, all right. So now the main idea of this particular podcast was to discuss federalism. And I really couldn't come up with a better guest to ask to talk federalism with us. It is what keeps me in the movement. I mean, I have a lot of energy for Convention of States, Ohio. But federalism and how that ties into all this is really a lock-in for me. So I have tried to imagine every which way, any one of the amendments that would come out of our three pillars of our movement, which is the government overreach, actually addressing anything, federal overreach, term limits for U.S. Congress, and fiscal restraint. So any of those three topics in our Convention of States movement. Okay, there could be others, but this is ours. Any one of them under any of those topics in there, we could probably come up with hundreds, right? Would promote federalism. So federalism, I'll give you my terms, and I think my terms are fairly solid because most of the people watching this podcast are not attorneys. They're certainly not constitutional attorneys or specialists in this area. So my terms, so the balance of power between the federal, state, and local governments, probably more federal and state, but the local falls under state. So there was by design a federalist, organization to the government that was supposed to keep the balance of power so that states had their sovereignty and the federal government had its place, which is very specific in the Constitution, which we now is really no longer happening. That's what we need to restore. But if it were balanced, then we would not be having the sorts of things going on that we have now, with us having to kind of choke down really Marxist ideology that's coming from the top.
Right.
So ideally, California is California, and it is still different than Indiana or Florida or Ohio, but it could be even more so if federalism were strengthened or recalibrated, as I like to say. So I believe that an Article 5 convention under our terms can definitely promote federalism. Specifically, when I say Marxism, and I tried to use this on a legislator and she didn't buy in, I'll keep trying, but we decentralize that federal government, states become more sovereign, and it's a whole lot harder to turn 50 states into a Marxist, country if there's 50 entities and not just one, right? So even with the education department, I mean, all those things factor in. So I see this as a way to appeal to the left or the right, because you could also argue that it's just obviously we have a hard time reaching out to the other side of the aisle and getting Democrats to believe in our movement. But I would maintain that all the things we stand for should concern a Democrat. But we could also say that federalism protects our whole country and all the states from right-wing ideologies, from some extreme right-wing governmental ideological push.
Absolutely.
I don't want that either. I've seen the right I've seen now the extreme fringe right wing. I don't want that either. So can we appeal to both sides this way? What do you think, Mark? Because I know we've got that messaging problem.
Yeah, look, I think the answer is yes. This is an entirely nonpartisan movement. I understand why people think it's partisan. So I want to address both of those things. One, it's nonpartisan. Like, our whole purpose, if you summarize it, is, and you did it beautifully, is federalism. In other words, what we really want is we want to restore the power balance, and the states are supposed to have the majority of the power. It's delegated, but it's non-specific, right? This is what the Constitution is set up to do. 17 enumerated powers to the federal government, everything else to the states and to the people. Unenumerated and unlimited to the states and to the people, enumerated and limited to the federal government. We've broken that system now. It seems like the federal government has 90% of the power. Instead of 17 enumerated powers, it seems like 17 million the courts have created. So what we're trying to do is get back to that balance. If we get back to that balance, which I believe we will, it means that California will have more power, New York will have more power, every liberal state, New Jersey will have more power. You name the leftist state, it's going to have more power, in the same way that conservative states are going to have more power. It means less federal government intervention, more power to the states. And that means, I hear this, whether I'm in California or in New York, the legislators are mad. The federal government intervenes all the time. They're more upset when it's a Republican administration in DC, in the same way that, frankly, conservatives like us are more upset when it's a liberal or Democrat administration in DC. So the key is take that power away from DC, give it back to the states, and let the states be the states. Now, sometimes when I'm out talking to conservatives, I was just in Connecticut recently, very liberal leftist legislature. The idea of that legislature having more power scares conservatives. But I always say, look, if you're against that, then you need to fight to elect more conservative people to your legislature, not try to limit the power of your legislature in the balance vis-a-vis the federal government. So in that way, it's absolutely nonpartisan. The simplest thing to say about Convention of States, the way to describe it is, it's a fight about who decides, the federal government or the people in the states. And almost everybody in America, by the way, thinks that the states ought to have more power. We recently did polling in Pennsylvania, which is a solid swing state at this point. And in Pennsylvania, what we found is that the majority of people of either party would be willing to switch parties to vote for someone in the state legislature that supports Convention of States. I mean, they would change their party registration. So this is how important this idea of federalism is to most people. I would also argue, and I think this is really important, that federalism is the perfect system for people who don't like each other. I know that sounds kind of funny, but we live in this very divided nation right now. This nation, by the way, has always been divided. People say more now than ever before. And I say, really, more now than the Civil War, or more now in the Revolution when you had Tories fighting against patriots? Is it more divided than that? We've always been divided, and I could walk you through all of American history. Almost always we've been divided. The real exception is World War II. But throughout most of American history, we've been very divided, state by state, region by region, different cultures. We are a vast country with hundreds of millions of people. We're not the same. And because of that, the founders designed a system to accommodate that kind of difference. If you think about what the Constitutional Convention itself was about, it was about states fighting against other states. They hated each other so much that prior to 1787, they were operating under the Articles of Confederation, which created a federal government or a central government with no power at all. because they didn't trust each other and they didn't like each other. And so when we get together in 1787, it's not because it's all kumbaya and everybody likes each other. It's that we just understand there's some existential threats that require that we do some things together, that we're more powerful together on foreign trade, on border stuff, theoretically, on foreign relations, on military stuff, all that stuff we kind of need to do together. And everything else was supposed to be left to the states. So here we are. That's not the case. Almost everything's being decided in DC. And you know what it does? It makes all of us angry. We're all frustrated. We're all over each other. Every presidential election is the most important of our lifetime. Every Supreme Court justice, most important of our lifetime. We got to have a just, I'll use the term bloodbath, a brawl over every issue that's a national issue. So if we say the states should have a lot more power, we'll have a lot less fighting. We can work it out at home. We can work it out in our communities, in our state legislatures. That's a much healthier way. And now I want to close this section by addressing this idea of, we're conservative and it seems very partisan. Look, I mean, I'm straight up honest about who I am. I don't want to hide that. I am a right-wing, conservative, Christian, gun-toting, Bible-thumping Tea Party kind of guy. That's who I am. I don't think that makes me alt-right, whatever that weird term means, or Christian nationalist, whatever they try to put on us. But I'm really honest about who I am and where I come from. My co-founder, Mike Ferris, well-known evangelical Christian. He was one of the lawyers involved in overturning Roe versus Wade through the Dobbs decision. You look at guys like Rick Santorum, longtime fighter for life, really serious Catholic guy. And you go on down the list, Ben Shapiro and all these guys who support us, they're all conservatives. And so I get why people on the left would look at that and say, well, I don't want to be involved in this, a bunch of conservative people. But if you peel away the personalities and look at the substance, the vast majority of Americans of either party support what we're doing.
Right. I actually heard Ben Shapiro say, somebody called into a show or wrote into a show and said, how does the country survive the polarization? He said federalism. That's what he said. Right. Yeah. And I like to tie in sort of what we're doing to, what the chatter is out there, the news cycle, things like that. And I had a friend approach me with a book and an author who she respected, who said that, we need a national divorce kind of thing. Actually, her words were, we just got to bust it up now and then every couple hundred years. That's how this works. And I thought, I can't envision that. Marjorie Taylor Greene said a national divorce, right? That she actually said that, which is insane because she is in Congress and she's supposed to be upholding the Constitution. And that would be not upholding the Constitution. And you can't, any logical person would look at that and, you might on the surface say, yeah, you're right. We do. We need that. We got to get away from these people, but you can't envision it because it's not possible. Who's going to get the coast? Who's going to get the debt? Who's going to take the social programs and the weapons and that? Like, it does not work no matter which way you slice it. The only logical thing is federalism, and conveniently the organization that I volunteer for happens to be promoting federalism with the convention, with their movement, specifically with these three things. So I'm so lucky to be involved in it because it really does match. It just matches beautifully to the kind of things that I'm hearing out there among the people who talk like that. And I have a tool, I have a way that I can say, no, that's not going to work. And you can't picture it. And here's why. And why don't you think about, supporting us and our efforts in an Article 5 Convention of States.
Yeah, look, I agree with you. It doesn't work. And I think it's irresponsible in a way when people talk about it. I do like the narrative. I get it. We are that divided. It feels like we're at the point of a divorce. But the reality is we just need some space from each other right now. And that's kind of where we're at in our national marriage. We need a little bit of room. We've been smothering each other. We're trying to force each other to do stuff. I mean, it is kind of, in a way, it's like a marriage, right? You can't force your spouse to be something they're not. You can't decide all the time for your spouse. And so what that means is you give each other a little bit of space. And in a relationship, whether it's a business relationship or a friendship or a marriage, there's always a little bit of space for people to be individuals. And that's true. That's what federalism is all about. I also think when people say, oh, we just need a national divorce, it's not responsible. What they're talking about is a civil war, because it's not going to happen peacefully. There's no possible scenario under which the federal government just lets some states leave, or states just say we're leaving and they go, and it's not violent. And how do you do that, even practically speaking? I live in Texas,
Right.
and people outside of Texas say, oh, good red state, I wish I lived in Texas. And it's a good red state. Well, I mean, except for near Austin where I live,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
Dallas, or
Right.
San Antonio, or El Paso, or you name the major city, they're red. So what does that mean you're going to do? Does that mean you kick out all the Democrats? And people jokingly say,
Right.
yeah, that's what you
Right.
do, but that can't work. And what do you do if you're in California where the geography is 85% red and the politics are very blue? I mean, how do you divide that up? I
You
just don't
can't.
think you
No.
can. And so what that means is we got to figure out how to work it out. There's a second factor, which is the existential threats. China is an existential threat to the United States of America. And the only way we're going to face off against them is as a nation. Texas can't face off against China. New York can't face off against China. As a nation, we can. So trying to separate ourselves off, even dealing with now the international narco cartels. I mean, these are literally international organizations with military level power. We're not going to face off against them one state at a time. We're going to have to do this as a nation. This is the way it's always been. At the time that they invented our federal government, they had existential threats from abroad. They still had England as a threat. Spain was a threat. Even the French, who were our largest creditor, they were a threat. And so we knew we had to find a way to be together, but we had to have sort of loose bonds that gave us the individual ability as states to be who we were.
Yeah. Our
Let- let-
adversaries like enjoy, sorry, Jeremiah, I don't mean to walk all over you.
Oh, you're good.
But our adversaries would certainly enjoy listening to people talk like, yeah, let's have a national divorce. That's like
Absolutely.
that they're just cracking up over that.
Well,
So
let
go
me
ahead,
ask you
Jeremiah.
this. Yeah, let me ask you this. We know that there's really no limit to what the progressive left will do. Is there any fear? I mean, whether we want a national divorce or not, is there any fear that we might divulge into civil war? I mean, we have illegals pouring over the border by the millions, and now they are allowed to carry guns. They're going to arm them.
Yeah.
Is there any fear that before we can call a convention, that we might devolve into something real, real bad?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I legitimately think about that and worry about that every single day. If you want to imagine what that looks like, one of my favorite authors, a friend of mine, a lawyer out of Los Angeles, his name is Kurt Schlichter. He writes for Town Hall as well. And he wrote a whole series of books about America coming apart and actually dividing. And it doesn't happen peacefully. There is violence, and it's ugly during and it's ugly afterwards. So you can look that up. I think the first book in that series, now 7-book series, is called The People's Republic. And they're novels. They're fun. They're not meant to be an exact projection of the future. If you like to read spy novels and those kind of shoot 'em up novels, they fit in that. The protagonist is Kelly Turnbull, who is a former special forces guy that goes back and forth between the blue states and the red states, rescuing people and stuff. So a fun, exciting read, kind of one of my guilty pleasures, but it lays out very realistically what this could look like. And one of the reasons Schlichter can write so realistically is he's a colonel in the army. He was a colonel in the army, went to the Army Strategy College. That was his specialty, was strategy. I asked him, how do you get it right so often? Why is it so realistic? And he said, look, this is what we're trained to do. You look at the chess pieces on the board, you look at where they're at, you look at what assets everybody has, and then you imagine all the different moves. And he said, so nothing I'm writing about, he said, you'll never read one of my books and say, oh, that's impossible. You might not think it's going to happen, but it's all potentially reasonable scenario. So I recommend you read those, and they'll give you a realistic picture. His latest book is out of the series. It's called the Attack, and he goes through and writes a history of the attack that takes place in the United States, fictional, of course. It's like an October 7 attack on Israel, but it's the U.S. version of that. And he writes it again based on looking at all the pieces on the board right now: open border, people coming in, the cartels having complete access, Chinese infiltration of our entire government and our infrastructure, Iranian involvement, and what could actually happen. So, no, I think it could actually happen. And one of the reasons that I'm such a big fan of convention of states is this is the pressure relief mechanism for this internal combat that we're having with each other. If I can say to people in New York, whatever, go be as crazy as you want in New York, and I'll just never live there, and they can say to us, go be crazy Texans, and we don't ever want to come there. That's how we stay together in a country.
Yeah, actually, what I read was that they called the individual states with their own power novel government programs, that their own little laboratories of democracy. And I like that a lot better than I like the series you described and the realistic possibility of us, as Jeremiah suggested. I don't want to devolve into warring with each other. I cannot stand the thought of that.
No,
So
and look, if New York gets it right or California gets it right, and that state is thriving and doing
right.
better than conservative states, then I know what's going to happen is Texas would look to California and say, well, it's working. Your people are happier. They're making more money. There's more fruit, whatever it is. And we'd say we should do some of that. I'm not so sure the left states would do that with the right-leaning states, but one can hope. But I
They
think
can
that
do
they
their
should be.
thing as long as the federal government isn't bailing them out when it does fail. That's my only worry. But if we're decentralized and everybody's taking care of themselves, then knock yourself out.
Yeah, and by the way, in a convention of states, we could legally, constitutionally prohibit the federal government from bailing out states that get into
Yeah.
financial trouble. And I think we ought to do that. The states
Yes.
should be required to stand on their own financially.
For
Even
sure.
look, I'm kind of an extremist about this stuff. This idea that we have FEMA that comes rushing in to the aid of states when states have environmental catastrophes, a weather catastrophe or whatever. I think states should voluntarily take care of each other if they want to. If states around Texas gets hit by a hurricane or tornadoes or whatever, and other states want to send mutual aid, I think that's awesome. And I love that kind of aid. But why are we robbing New York to pay for Texas's hurricane or whatever? I just don't believe we ought to be doing that. And I think the framers would have thought that was crazy.
I mean, if we're to promote sovereignty, then we also have to accept the fact that we're not going to have, the backup of a federal, treasury or something to help us out. I could think about that.
Well, and FEMA
Hey,
didn't always exist either, so these states had to do
Well.
something before.
Yep.
But when you have that, then you're just more controlled, right?
Yep.
When you take that money, there's just always strings attached, right? So, one more item that I had for you tonight, Mark, before Matt comes in, our producer had a question for you. Is bear with me on this. So, I think about federalism and the Article 5 effort as a whole as a rather abstract idea. Like, it's hard to explain to people. It takes a while. You have to kind of finesse it. And I was recently at a couple of meetings. I've been following around some of our legislators. They've had some local meetings. They're trying to promote some legislation to bring Ohio to zero income tax, which I can get behind. Obviously, that's right in our wheelhouse, right?
Love that.
And I was interested, and it was a couple of supporters that I knew, and I wanted to show my face. There's all kinds of reasons why I went to these two meetings, and I'm completely fascinated with it. And I'm listening, and I'm learning a lot about what potentially would have been conservative people that I thought were. And I think I was about the only one in the room that was like, hey, go for it. And I raised my hand a few times and tried to sort of in support, recognizing that when you reduce taxes greatly or significantly, like in the Reagan era, I knew in the era of Ronald Reagan, government actually grew because taxes went down, but revenue went up.
Yes.
And I can think like that. I don't know why. I guess I listened to enough over the years that I believe it, and I knew it, and I was fascinated by that fact. But nobody in the room, except maybe the gentlemen that were proposing this, understood that. It's an abstract thought, and I think maybe we had trustees in the room, maybe that they look at the numbers, right? And they're looking at the numbers and looking at that, and they can't get behind it, at least not yet as it's been presented. But I'll acknowledge that I'm not in charge of the numbers or the budget or paying these people and salaries and things that these localities, these municipalities have to worry about. So I'll acknowledge that. But I got the feeling that it's such an abstract thing that they can't wrap their brain around the possibility of going zero income tax, that just saying, well, but we'll have plenty of income in other ways. It'll happen here. They named several different ways, but it still didn't stick. Like, these abstract things and these ideas, convention of states, federalism, and zero tax. And how do we reach people who don't always think in those abstract terms like that? Like, how do you reach that? And can Americans think like that?
Yeah, I think narrative simplification is super important. How you define the terms of the fight is how you win the fight. It's not actually, the fight's usually won before you have the fight. And so On the income tax one, I mean, for me, it's relatively easy to simplify that now. Every state that has a zero income tax or near zero income tax is booming right now in the United States of America. There's a mass migration to the southern states right now because so many of them have a zero income tax, whether you're talking Florida or Texas or Tennessee or South Carolina. Every one of those states is a booming state with healthy infrastructure. Tax revenues are up. End of story for me. Like Ohio, why can't you imagine this? It's actually happening. I don't need to explain it to you. Just go look at all these other
Right.
states where it's
Right.
is it
Not
because
that
those
novel.
places have a warmer climate than you that you can't do? Like I don't get
Right.
it. And
Right.
so the simple way for me is, well, you don't have to agree or disagree. Just go look at all the states where they're doing it.
Yeah.
And every state that's moving towards a zero income tax, and there are many states in that on that path right now, they're all growing. Because look, I moved to Texas. One of the reasons I wanted to get out of California for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is 30% of my dollars in my pocket instead of the government's pocket.
Yeah.
I want you to imagine how much money that is, right?
Yeah.
For an average person. I'm not wealthy. I had my accountant look at this before I moved. I said, "What will this mean to me?" And he said, 30% in your pocket. And I said, "Well, that's like a free house, basically."
Mhm.
And he said, "Well, yeah, but you'll have a nicer house."
Yeah.
And he was right. We moved here, everything's cheaper. It's not that we don't have problems in Texas. Property taxes are really high here. We're working on that. But I think that's the simple way to say it is look at Texas, South Carolina, Florida. These are booming economies with a zero income tax. On the convention of states, for me, the simplification is it's this simple. I say, are you somebody who believes that you should make the decisions for yourself? Between you and your doctor, you and your city, you and your county, you and your state, or do you like Washington, D.C. telling you what to do? Almost everybody will say, no, I want to make the decisions. Who
Mhm.
decides is the question. The answer is me and my wife, me and my family, me and my doctor. So if you believe that, then you believe in convention of states because right now, DC, some bureaucrat 1,500 miles,
Right.
2,000 miles away from you is making the decisions for you. You have literally no input on that. You probably want those decisions closer to home. I'll tell you, I speak in places as diverse as Tulsa, Oklahoma. And a couple weeks from now, I'm speaking to a poli-sci class at UC Berkeley. And when I say who decides, do you want to decide for yourself? At UC Berkeley, they'll say, yeah, of course we want to decide for ourselves. So we have that in common. To me, that's the very simple narrative. And I start from there.
Very good. Very interesting. Simplify the message. Well, they could just watch this podcast and they'd be totally convinced. If Michael Ferris's testimony on February 6th didn't already do that.
Oh my gosh, that was
Yeah,
good.
it was very, very good. So, Jeremiah,
By
you
the
got
way,
any?
I just have to say, as a side note, your whole team was absolutely unbelievable in that testimony. That was a master class in how to give testimony before state legislature. Professional lobbyists should watch that to be better at their jobs. Honestly,
Thank
you
you.
guys were
We
so
appreciate the
good.
compliment, and
Yeah.
there was a lot of hard work done on behalf of several of us, and um, we appreciate it very much. Jeremiah, anything? I'm going to push over to Matt here in a second. If you're
Bring him on.
bring him on, okay, Matthew. So my son, Mark and Jeremiah, he is a homeschool senior in high school. Matthew, you there? You can pop in if you want. And he was trying to avoid, I can put him in any class if I deem worthy. And at high school level, we do that. And he was trying to avoid this government class at this place where we normally would have him take a course. And he talked me into doing it. And, I can do government. I can do that. So we did do Constitutional Live. Okay. So I think Jeremiah is familiar with it. So, we took those classes together, had a lot of really, really, really good conversations. And then this podcast then out of that became his permanent capstone project. So that's how this worked. And whether he knows it or not, he's pretty much stuck doing this for a really long time. So Matt, I'll let you take it from here. So you did some diving in and did some IT work or something. Go ahead and I'll let you.
So at the University of Cincinnati, I'm taking a class, an English class. One of the assignments was to find a problem, whether it was just this worldwide thing, something local, whatever scale it is.
Right.
But the point of the assignment was to research the problem and just gather sources and write about them and make annotations on them. So one of the topics I wanted to cover was privacy. And I stumbled upon this video from a YouTube channel called Smarter Every Day. The video is called "Is Your Privacy an Illusion?" And so the guy, Destin Sandlin, made a few good points that I'd like to share. So I'm going to put my slideshow up here. Okay, that's great. So in his video, these are all screenshots from his video, so I am going to credit him here. And I'll credit him in post as well. This is a drone shot of data centers of big tech companies. I believe this one is Google, the one you're looking at right now, but there are all sorts of them from Facebook Meta, and TikTok is a big one. TikTok gets its own other category. You're talking about China, and that's just a whole separate thing because they have their own things. But this is what they look like. So let's just go to the next slide here. So he looked at a map of like properties and stuff, and he figured out that the owner of this property was actually the United States of America, which I thought was really interesting, which is just kind of a little red flag there. And I'm going to get to the point here in just a second. Google actually has a dollar amount that they will sell data to the government for. Because the government can have these gag orders that makes it so they can share the data, and they're not allowed to tell citizens when this happens. And they actually have like a published dollar amount for it. So here's the big point here, that Amendment 4 basically protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures for your belongings, your assets, your papers, your documents that are on your property that you own. So the big hole in this is that this was made way back when the amendments were first ratified. But nowadays we have the internet, and we have these other companies that are holding on to this digital data. So what I'm proposing is an amendment that adds on to Amendment 4 that includes digital assets like from that are on other companies, and that way that the government can't just constantly pull all this data, because the only way you have digital assets protected is if you have like a server in your basement, maybe like an email server or just a server to store pictures, but that have to be on your property in your basement, and it cannot be on the cloud, because the cloud is all owned by Google, these big buildings that happen to be on the property of the US, which is stands out to me. It's kind of a big red flag there. So one way to do this is like encryption, where the user holds the key to all of the data, and there's only one way to access the data, and it's on it. The user holds it. That is one way to do it, but that is my proposal, is that we add a new amendment that adds on to Amendment 4 that says, okay, your digital assets that are like just on the cloud or under your account somewhere on the internet of some sort, that just includes digital assets or that are outside of your house. And that's all I got for you.
So I would say yes, yes, and absolutely yes. Look, this is a multifaceted problem. We're seeing this play out in the courts in real time right now with some of these censorship issues. But I think the fundamental facet that you're hitting is the government is avoiding the Fourth Amendment. And the way that they're doing that is that they're actually purchasing this data from third-party companies. So this is stuff they would absolutely, it is completely unconstitutional for them to collect this kind of data on you. When the federal government is going to collect information on you, they're going to go out and do a search on Matt. They need to have probable cause to do that search. They can't do the search to find probable cause. They already have to have probable cause. And that requires then some kind of a warrant. They go to a judge, say, here's our probable cause. We think Matt's doing bad stuff. We need to be able to search his files. Well, now what they do is they just go out and they just purchase that data in the open market. And I actually don't have a problem with knowing data sales. Like, I know Google has my data and I know they sell it. And if I want to use Google, that's my deal with Google. Google's free to me, right? And the only reason it's free is because they have access to my data. I think people are confused. They think Google's the product. We're the product. Our data is the product, right? We're being sold. Information about us is being sold. If you know that and you choose to do that, I'm fine with that. What I'm not fine with is I didn't consent to the government being the customer for my data and circumventing the Fourth and Fifth Amendments by buying data from these third-party providers. And so I think we need an amendment that prevents the federal government from purchasing data from third-party providers. I think every provider should be limited in their. Another way to do this outside of an amendment is to pass a law that says that these third-party providers can sell your data if they have the appropriate disclosures, but that they may not sell to the government. And they may only provide your information to the government via a legitimate warrant. And those warrants are issued all the time, and these companies comply with those. There's a second layer to this problem, Matt, that I think is it might be more serious. And that layer is that people in your generation don't ever even think about privacy. It's like, people, you're probably not doing this, but a lot of people your age are putting their entire lives online. They don't think about it. Every emotional thought they've ever had in their life, every stupid thing they've ever done in their life, they're filming it, they're putting it online. The internet is forever. They don't think about that because that's what they've grown up with. And so they have no conception of the idea of privacy. The framers were very strong on privacy. If you were out in public, you had no expectation of privacy. If you were home, then, or you were having a private conversation, then you had a very high expectation of privacy. But that's not the younger generations today. Maybe me, and I'm 62. Your mom looks much younger than me. I don't know how old you are, Diana, but you look a lot younger than I do.
53.
Okay, so we grew up in an era when privacy actually meant something. And like it would seem weird. And if you wanted to spy on me or your mom when we were your age, you would have to get a warrant and tap our phones or something.
Right.
And so it was outside of our scope of experience, and we had an expectation of privacy. Unfortunately, the younger generation are like, whatever, privacy, I don't care. No. And you'll hear a phrase all the time, Matt, where you'll hear people say, well, I'm not doing anything wrong anyway, so why do I care if
I hear that all the time. But...
Right. And so one of the things that I think people need to understand, this is an actual real life experience for me. When I had founded the Tea Party, we're doing all this stuff. And I actually had somebody, I still don't know who to this day, come steal my trash from the end of my driveway and go through my trash. It's a very weird experience. And they brought it back. And that's even weirder. Like, it's not just that the trash left and never came back. Right. They brought it back, clearly rifled through it. And I ended up talking to people at the FBI and former FBI agents who were helping us. Back then, there were still some reputable FBI. I wouldn't talk to FBI today. And I said, well, why would they bring it back? And he said, well, one, they want you to know they went through it, because then you're going to be freaking out. They're putting pressure on you as a political figure. And I said, yeah, but there's nothing in my trash. My actual specialty, Matt, I'm really passionate about this. I was a privacy attorney. Like, that's my thing.
Yeah.
And so he said, oh, so you think that they have to find something in your trash? Like, what do you mean? He's like, if they want to find something, they'll put something there. And then they'll just say they found it. And the same is true nowadays, more and more, for our social media accounts or whatever. We've got this AI, we've got these deep fakes being produced now. It's terrifying. There could be video of you doing horrible things out there. It's not you. It looks exactly like you. You end up in a fight trying to say this. So your privacy, being able to protect your likeness, like normally it used to be only famous people that worried about how their likeness was used. How would you feel if now there was an image of Matt out there spouting things from the Communist Manifesto and saying, this is the only way, this is the way? You'd be horrified by that. But the reality is right now, there's really no way for you to protect yourself against that. So I think we're entering a new era where privacy is very important. Really going to have to educate the dangers of lack of privacy and why this is so important. But going back to your very first point, I'm absolutely in favor of an amendment which prevents the federal government from buying any kind of data that they're not able to get without a warrant with due cause.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that would be something definitely to add on.
I have to say, Diana, you're doing something right, because Matt, I've heard everything. Nobody's ever suggested that to me before.
Well, that's awesome.
So good job.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's really interesting too that the messaging, that's something that people might relate to. They're getting afraid of AI, and maybe we do need to write some theoretical amendments and say, hey, Article 5 could do this, and you need to be afraid of that. I know you are. Think about it, and we can do that in a convention. Overreach, it falls under overreach. Very simply.
I can't stand when people say I don't care about privacy because I have nothing to hide. It's like saying I don't care about the freedom of speech because I have nothing to say. It's like, just doesn't make any sense.
I mean,
you
said someone was stealing your garbage.
Yeah.
I mean, you're probably thinking, well, okay, I'm just throwing away my garbage. I got nothing to hide, right? But then as soon as someone actually steals it, you're like, wait a second. I don't want anyone to steal my garbage. You know what I'm saying? You don't care until someone actually does it. And it's just constantly happening in the background in secret. Yeah. So that's just the reality of it.
Well, you nailed it. You gave me a new idea. I'll be spreading this all over the country.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
Very good. Thanks, Matt. That was awesome.
Thank you, Matt.
So, and that's kind of a wrap up here. Thank you, all three of you, Mark, Jeremiah, and Matt. It was an awesome podcast, and I'm glad to have shared it with you. I appreciate the time that you spent. And Jeremiah, I'd like to give you a moment. Jeremiah, I think, if I'm not mistaken, has 2 podcasts now, and I'm going to let him tell you how to find those 2, and you can describe them, Jeremiah. And also that Jeremiah and Mark did a podcast together. Jeremiah hosted Mark, and gentlemen, it was phenomenal. I actually listened to it yesterday.
That was a great one.
Into today a little bit more knowledgeable, and it was outstanding. So great work there. And Jeremiah, go ahead and take it.
I appreciate it. No, I get a lot of compliments on that episode. So thanks for coming on, Mark. Again, Anatomy of the Church and State. You can find full episodes on Rumble. You can find me on X at Jesus and Liberty, and clips on YouTube at Jesus and Liberty as well. Jesus and Liberty being 2 of my favorite things. And by the time this podcast airs, yes, Diana is right. I will be doing a Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time, Pray with America show. Just a quick 10 minutes, get your day started. I'll be picking a couple issues that we're going to tackle, and we're going to pray about them. I invite all of America to come and bow your heads in prayer with us. And the power of prayer is real. So let's harness it.
Wonderful. And if you are listening to this show right now, the recordings of all the podcasts, including this one, will be housed on conventionofstates.com/Ohio. And there's a podcast button that'll be there. We'll be posting it to YouTube. We'll be posting it to X. We'll be posting it to Facebook. And then please share these with friends if you think that you're listening and you think they have they're worthy, which they are. Please share. And if you are new to Convention of States and you are inspired, hopefully, to help us out, you can go to conventionofstates.com and go to the top of the page and hit take action. You can also send me an email, and I will take good care of you. Diana Tellis at cosaction.com. That's DIANA.TELLES at cosaction.com. And in our next episode, Jeremiah and I will be speaking to Steve Jones, regional captain. We will be discussing the church's role in politics, and we will find a way to tie that back to Article 5, because we can tie anything to Article 5. And that is a wrap. Thank you guys so much, and God bless.
Thank you. God bless you guys.